Hello, you're listening to Me and Paranormal You with your host, Ryan Singer. Because it's more fun to believe.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to another experience of Me and Paranormal You. I've got my buddy, Dr. Jeff Tarrant, here for the third or fourth time, I think. Third time. We're excited about this chat. And by we, I mean me and everybody listening, even if they don't know it. Time isn't linear. We understand that. Because much to my great delight, after being highly recommended by multiple friends who I trust their opinions on such matters, I listened to the Telepathy Tapes podcast. And who do you know would pop up on, I think episode 2 is when you first pop up, is you, Jeff. And I'm at a treadmill at a Planet Fitness in Dayton, Ohio. And it's probably like 10:30 at night or something. And then all of a sudden I hear you right after your intro on this podcast. And I exclaim loudly, "Oh, no shit." And just on a treadmill. And people are like, what is this guy doing over here? But so if you haven't listened to previous interviews that I've already done with Dr. Tarrant, I highly recommend you go back and do that. I can catch you up to speed just a little bit. We've got psychicmindscience.com is the main website where you can find everything that he's doing since 2012, I believe, is when you started performing experiments on psychics, mediums, channels, and trying to understand the psychokinetic ability. Can it be measured by brain maps and other experimentation? And you have found interesting patterns in these things. And you've been kind of swallowed by this work. You also have the I believe it is the Neuromeditation Institute, and you can go to @Neuromeditation Institute on YouTube, and there's videos that get put out constantly, seemingly it looks like on a weekly basis over there. If you're looking for help in meditation practices and you're interested in the science that goes into meditation and all of the numerous benefits associated with that have been measured and shown. So it's time to put down the phone and do some meditation instead of all of us just talking about it all the time. Thanks for coming back again, Jeff.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me back on.
So we were chatting, and we're chatting about something else that we're working on together. Just a spoiler alert for people listening. It has to do with Florida, and something I'm incredibly excited about, a return trip that's happening, and we're going to see how all the details shake out, but I'll have more information about that obviously at a later date for people. And then we start, and I start messaging you like, "Oh, I just heard you on the Telepathy Tapes. This is so great." And then we decided, why don't we chat about this? And your involvement, season 1 is completely out. It has skyrocketed to the charts, which I wasn't aware of, but I'm really glad to hear. And will you tell me just a little bit about, for people who might be finding this podcast because of your involvement with the Telepathy Tapes and Kai Dickens project, can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the first place, or how they found you?
Yeah. I guess the whole thing started maybe, 3 years ago now. And, Diane Hennessy Powell is kind of the main researcher on the Telepathy Tapes, who really started talking about some of these non-speaking autistic individuals that apparently demonstrate telepathic abilities. And she's been talking about this for a while. And so anyway, and I knew Diane through other connections. And Diane had contacted me and said, "Hey, we're going to be doing some more work on this. Do you want to do some brain mapping on, some of these kids?" And at this point, I knew basically nothing about any of this. And I said, "Yeah, sounds like fun, right? I mean, that's right up my alley, the kind of work that I do." And then she said, "Hey, there's this documentarian who may be wanting to make a show out of this. Would you want to be involved in that?" I was like, "Yeah, of course." And that was Kai. And so met with Kai. I'd already known Diane, and met with Kai. We hit it off, got along great. And so I kind of became part of the team. And so initially the idea was to turn this into a docuseries or a documentary, that would be pitched to Netflix or Amazon or whatever, one of those channels. And so so at this point, I've been able to test and work with 3 different non-speakers who have these abilities. And all of that testing was filmed because it was going to be part of the sizzle reel, to pitch this. And so it was really the primary function of all of that was getting footage, to make for an interesting story. And we said, well, we'll come back later once we get some funding and once we know what we're doing, and we'll do more elaborate tests. And so, again, who knew it was going to go this route? And so, as things developed, and I collected some of this data and was, there for a lot of the testing that was done, which blew my mind. And we can talk about that in a minute. And so one thing after another, but, Kai decided to kind of go a podcast route first and to get the story out there, and then turn this into something else, film-wise later. So the Telepathy Tapes came out. It's obviously been a huge, crazy success. I didn't actually expect that to happen at all. I'm not sure what it takes for something to go viral, but that's clearly what happened. I guess you hit a big enough number and then things get a life of their own. And so, so I'm still part of the project, and we're actually talking about doing some follow-up testing and EEG imaging in the near future. So I'm really excited about that, to get back out there again.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking as someone who has listened to the whole season, the first season, and I don't know when there's plans for a second season of the podcast coming out, but obviously we'll be keeping an eye and an ear open for those. But I mean, it definitely strikes a heartfelt nerve, right? There's something about, the way it's produced and put together and edited. She does a magnificent job. You can tell she's a very skilled documentarian, and it makes me want to go watch her previous work for sure, which is on my to-do list. But it's beautifully made, because I think, like any great documentary, the filmmaker isn't in the way, right? And the subject, and specifically this subject of, the non-speakers and their abilities and their family members also, she really shines a light on them and lets them shine, because they have their own light that's shining so brightly, and it's moving, it's touching, it's heartfelt. You can tell it's not coming from a place of exploitation, which is very important, because I think experiencers in psi phenomena and the paranormal, there's so much ridicule and judgment that is experienced over the years, and you could probably speak to that as well as, a medical professional who is interested in this stuff. And that's one of the themes also touched on in this series that I hope someday we can just not even have to have that conversation anymore. I don't know if we've really spoken about that in regards to your experience in the medical field and in science. How, your reception when it comes to, other people in the field.
Yeah. And, and so, I'll comment on that, but also just to follow up with what you were saying. I mean, one of the things that I was super impressed with is, Kai's integrity, really wanting to tell this story a certain way. And she's not really willing to bend on that. She really wants it to be this story about these individuals and their families, and, wants to make sure that they're not exploited. So I really appreciate that about the way that she has handled this. I mean, really impressive. And as far as my own experience, and I should mention, I'm not actually a medical doctor, I'm a psychologist. But it's interesting because, I've been doing this work on and off, working with psychics and mediums and healers and things for, like you said, 2012-ish or something like that. So it's been a minute. It's not like it's new for me. But it hasn't been out there in the public quite so much, except for the last few years. And as soon as I started kind of getting out there more, and then, I published a book last year, and that was really what started getting a lot of attention in terms of other people, other scientists, other colleagues that maybe didn't know I was doing this. And then all of a sudden I've got this book out there and I'm being more vocal about what I was doing. And it was funny because one of the very first things that happened was I got a cold email. I had been collaborating with a group in Germany who shall remain unnamed. But I was basically an advisor for their program, which was a science-based, very heavy science-based psychedelic integration training program. And they were incorporating some of the neuromeditation work into their program. And I actually went through their training, which was, like a year-long training. And as soon as my stuff started coming out, I got an email from them that basically said, since I've decided to engage in non-scientific work, that I wasn't a good fit for their program anymore, and essentially fired me.
Wow.
Which was kind of a surprise because I didn't have a conversation with them. It was basically just like, you're going down this weird path and we don't want any connection with it. And so, I was cut off immediately. And,
not even a conversation.
And no. And so, that was interesting. And honestly, that's been sort of probably the biggest negative response I've had. I'm sure there are other people out there who have stopped following me or stopped paying attention to what I'm doing because they think I've gone off the deep end. But honestly, I'd say there's more people who have sort of come out of the closet, so to speak, that it's like, oh, wow, you're talking about this. People who actually have interest in these things, but have kind of kept it under wraps for the same reason, that it's like, it's not okay to talk about these things. And so I've actually seen more of a positive response than a negative response. Now, with the telepathy tapes, I'm starting to get hammered a bit for my role in that, by people I don't know, just random skeptics who are, writing articles kind of slamming the science of the telepathy tapes. And
the pushback is, I haven't partaken in even like glancing at the skeptical, the scientific pushback against the telepathy tapes. And now, granted, I'm all in. I'm a wild one. You know this about me. People listening know this. It strikes me as absurd that people would be so hell-bent on trying to push back against such a beautiful presentation of a phenomena that is clearly occurring.
Yeah. I mean, and to be fair, some of their criticisms, I think, are valid. There's a couple of issues. One is that the telepathy tapes was not designed to be a scientific experiment. And so to look at that from that lens is a bit unfair on the surface, because it's kind of apples and oranges a little bit. You could think of what we did as a series of case studies, but case studies from a scientific perspective don't hold a lot of water. It's an instance of something interesting. And it's like, okay. And there are some valid concerns that the skeptics bring up, in terms of like the fact that in many of the experiments that we did, the person holding the letterboard, which is how a lot of these, all of them that I've worked with, how the non-speakers communicate. They communicate by pointing to letters or numbers on a letterboard to spell things out or to identify, numerical values. And a lot of times, the mom is the one holding the letterboard, right? So the skeptics can make an argument that it's like, well, there's some sort of subtle cueing going on. The mom's moving the letterboard a little bit to kind of help them know where they're supposed to go, to identify certain things. And, that's a valid criticism. I mean, I saw these tests over and over and over and again. And, when you see it with your own eyes, there's basically, I don't know how you could walk away and not believe what you're seeing. But if you're just hearing this or looking at it, you don't know, you didn't see it. And so, it makes sense that there's going to be, it's an outrageous claim that there's these kids who are essentially 100% telepathic. They don't miss. And that's an outrageous claim, right? And so it makes sense that people are going to be like, okay, like this needs to be airtight. What you did wasn't airtight. So there's other possible explanations for what we're seeing.
Can we hurry, let's sterilize this. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the phrase outrageous claim, because I understand, and completely understand what you're saying from that other perspective. We're going to take a quick break, and just as a reminder, patreon.com /Ryan Singer, that is where you can go, and for $3 a month you can listen to all of these episodes without commercials, and every once in a while, even be a free member over it. You don't have to pay any money to be a member of the Patreon. We'd love to have you over there because you get free stuff too. So we're going to be right back with Dr. Jeff Tarrant. We're going to talk more about the telepathy tapes and the outrageous claims that materialism is claiming have been made by this outlandish, unbelievable that anyone would listen to this podcast. Okay, we're back. I got Dr. Jeff here. We're talking about the telepathy tapes, his involvement, and probably the best podcast I've heard. And gosh, and I don't know how long, maybe all time at this point. But you bring up an interesting point when, there's valid criticisms from the scientific community or from the hardcore skeptics of psi phenomena. And I'm not here to say that they're on some kind of, unholy mission. But at times, just like everything else, there will be people who, for some reason, find it their personal mission, for some reason, to try and dispel anything that lies outside of the materialistic paradigm, and even starts flirting with idealism. And I'm an idealist, so obviously I'm on board. Right from the get-go, as soon as I hear someone say maybe consciousness, and I'm like, say no more, I'm involved. Right. So I admit that about myself. But when we look at the word outrageous, and framing that and understanding why someone from the materialistic point of view would find something like this so outrageous, is it because it's threatening, or is it because it's ridiculous, or a combination of both?
I mean, I think the main issue, right, is that, I think there's a couple of things, but one of them is that, if you already are approaching this with the belief that it's impossible, that there's no way telepathy can happen, if that's your belief system and you're coming into this, then it doesn't really matter what I say or what the science says. And we see this in psi research all the time. Anybody who's been doing psi research, for, the last decades has run up against this. Like, you could build the most airtight research ever. It could be replicated dozens of times, but it's not going to satisfy the people who already have an ideology that says that this is impossible. There's nothing you can do. It's, it becomes sort of its own, almost religion, that, you can't, there's no way you can't debate it. There's nothing you can say or do that's going to change that, because it's impossible. Now, I like to be a little more open-minded, and, and it's like, well, there's a lot of things that we thought were impossible until it wasn't, right? Until, all of a sudden there's like other evidence. The reason I said outrageous claim is because, most of these kids are basically 100% accurate. And so that's what I mean by outrageous, right? Because if you look at the history of telepathy research, and there's a lot, Like telepathy has been studied for decades, and actually more like over 100 years. Telepathy's been studied from a research perspective, and the evidence is actually pretty good that telepathy exists. And even in sort of folks who communicate verbally. However, the results are not super impressive. So a typical telepathy test, you might have a sender and a receiver. The sender is looking at an image or something, and they're trying to mentally send that image to the receiver, who's in a different room, and they're isolated from each other, so there's no way there can be any cueing. And then the receiver, they might report verbally whatever they're getting, imagery in their mind or something. But then at the end of that time, they're given a forced choice option. So they might be shown 4 pictures and say, well, one of these is the correct picture. Which one do you think it is? Right? So you've got a 25% chance of just guessing and getting it right. And so with a lot of this research, they're getting 30 or 35% right, which it's statistically significant. It's better than chance, but it's not super impressive, right? You're getting a little bit better than chance with a forced choice. So then when we look at these kids, these non-speakers, it's not a forced choice. We're doing things like showing the mom. In all the cases I looked at, it was the mom who was the sender. They seem to have a stronger connection with their mom than other folks. But we could show the mom a randomized 3-syllable word, and the speller then spells out that word perfectly, and so it's not even a forced choice, right? So something like an open response, like what we're talking about, is way more difficult than having 4 choices that you pick one. So this is what I mean by outrageous, right? Like they're getting them right every time, and it's an open response. So, on the surface, that looks impossible. But yet here it is.
Yeah, it looks like, hey, step right in. We've got, a marvel of the world inside this tent. You know what I mean? Just give me all of your money before you walk through the curtain. Because it's a more difficult test, and the results are astonishingly, outrageously more correct than the forced option. Okay, that's interesting, because I didn't realize, I never considered the forced option part of previous telepathy or experiments, because in my mind I'm like, if you're a baseball player and you hit 300 for your career, you're going into the Hall of Fame. And so for me, I always thought, hey, if you're getting 30% as someone doing these experiments and testing on telepathy, you're going to the Hall of Fame in my book, right?
Right.
But then these non-speakers come in and they're like, oh, baseball isn't hard.
Right.
In fact, it's the easiest thing. I've just always been able to be the absolute best and perfect at baseball.
Right.
And if someone came along in the world of baseball and never made an out and batted 1,000 or 100%, the world would probably stop playing baseball, because they're like, like, we can't, why play against this person? It's not fair anymore. And I think there is some fear for people that is, loosely related to this outrageous, metaphor or analogy I'm making between telepathy and baseball. But, that whole like, oh, I don't want them to know my thoughts, and it's like the secrets. Like when we were in Florida last time, remember when we got busted at the hospital?
Yeah.
So Bill takes us to where he works. So Florida's, without getting into too many details about the exact location. Anyway, we get kicked out of this place that's under construction. And one of the security guards immediately, knowing that Dr. Rebecca Foster was with us, who's a psychic, because he was told by Bill, oh, they got a psychic in there checking it out. As soon as we walk out, the one security guard's like, oh, you're the psychic. Don't read my mind. Like, it's like, what's in your mind, bro? What secrets are you holding? Right? But that's a common fear you hear people say, like, I don't want them to, read my thoughts. But, so it's fascinating. But the idea that it's outrageous, I understand, and I'm not here to, judge too harshly. But when it comes to, the acceptance of the possibility of something that has been shown so starkly to be happening is, it's difficult for me to understand the resistance to such a thing.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, again, like they haven't seen it, and they've seen like very small little clips that are on the Telepathy Tapes website, and some of them are more impressive than others. So there's a little bit of cherry picking in terms of, which clips they're pointing out some issues with and things like that. There's also clips on there that very clearly show people being able to do this, some of these non-speakers, where they're in a separate room from their mom. They're typing independently the response onto a computer keyboard. Nobody's holding anything for them. And so literally there's no way that there could be some sort of cheating or something else. I mean, it's funny. My office manager is actually a huge skeptic. And she thinks all this stuff that I do is completely nutso. And I was talking to her about these experiments. And she said, well, Penn and Teller could do it. And I was like, and I said, I was like, that's probably true, but these guys aren't Penn and Teller, right?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, some of the best magicians in the world could figure out a way to pull this off and, make it look real. That's true, right? Like they can do all kinds of crazy things. But these are a bunch of families who are basically just trying to get by, right? They've got kids who are severely autistic that they've been just struggling to get an education and to be able to communicate, and to keep their families kind of moving forward. These aren't families who are trying to scam anybody or trying to come up with some elaborate way to trick the system, and it's not just one family, right? It's a bunch of families. And so again, to me, the more you look at it, it's like, yes, could somebody kind of make this up if they were a really skilled magician? Sure. Is that what's happening here? I don't see how that would be possible, right? Like it's not feasible. It's not a feasible explanation in my mind.
Yeah. To me, it's that old adage about, I forget what it's called, but the most likely reason is, or the most obvious reason is the most likely or something.
Yeah,
or
Occam's razor.
Yeah, Occam's razor. So yeah, I mean, Occam, but in this case, it's like, a bunch of different families, like you said, who have been, struggling to get by, fighting for resources their entire life, fighting against a system which seemingly doesn't have the best interests of the people they're supposed to be supporting in mind, seemingly. It's not like they all got together and been like, it would be great if we had a bunch of ridicule and judgment heaped on top of what we've already experienced in that regard.
Right.
Let's make everyone think that we're also whack jobs, and, the negative woo ones, and, believe in fairy tales and things like that. And so from that regard, I understand, like, when you say that if someone thinks something's impossible, there's no way. They're like, oh, we conducted some experiments about the best way to summon a troll. And someone's like, well, trolls aren't real, so I'm not going to pay attention to anything that you've done here, because the foundational aspects of your test are just make-believe fairy tale. Right. So,
right.
So from that point of view, I guess I understand, but seeing is believing, it's often said, but I feel like experiencing is knowing. And you've been in the room when these tests have happened. I want to go to the first time
Sure.
that you saw this and were able to experience it. Considering you've already, done a ton of research with amazing people, who show extraordinary abilities, psychic, psychokinetic, etc. What was your reaction upon first seeing this, like bat in 1,000, 100% that the non-speaker exhibited?
Yeah. I mean, my first reaction was probably my jaw hitting the floor. I mean, again, like realistically, when I got myself into this, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I didn't know the degree, and I'm sure Diane told me that, oh, these kids are perfect, right? And I was kind of like, oh yeah, sure, okay, whatever. I was expecting they were probably better than Chance, but then when I saw, I mean, the first time we did it was we rented an Airbnb in Burbank, and to film this and kind of set up a neutral. So we had a neutral location where we all came in, the camera crew, Kai, Dr. Powell was there, I was there. And then this was working with Mia, and she was featured actually in episode 1 of the Telepathy Tapes. So her family is Spanish speaking. So they came up from Mexico for this. One of the cousins speaks English, and so she was kind of the primary translator. And yeah, I mean, we just tested this kid all day long. And, we could set up a circumstance in which she would fail, but it was like, it's because we kept pushing the bounds. It's like, well, what if we do this? Well, what if we do this? Well, what if we do this? But if we stuck with her mom being the sender and Mia being the receiver, she just didn't miss. And we started off, and I think the very first test was a random number generator test. So they had an app on an iPad, and you could select a range of numbers. And so, I can't remember if it was a 3-digit number or a 4-digit number to start with. But, let's say it was a 3-digit number. And so you say, okay, pick a number between, you're telling the computer, between 100 and 999. And then you hit the button and it randomly picks a number. So let's say it was 642. And so Dr. Powell does this, shows it to the mom, turns the iPad face down so that nobody can see it. And all her mom does is puts her finger on Mia's forehead, and Mia immediately on the number board, 642. Very clear. There's no, there's no question that, she was very precise. She was very fast with how she did it. And, and then they just like over and over. Well, let's do a 4-digit number. Let's do flashcards. Let's grab a book off of the bookshelf and open it to a random page and pick out a random word, right? Like it really didn't matter what test we did. If we had that basic configuration, she got them all right. She would spell words. If we gave her a flashcard and it was written in English, now remember, they don't speak English. She would write the word out in English, right? So like, it wasn't even like she translated it into Spanish. Yeah, for me, so when this initial testing was going on, I was actually outside because we were trying to minimize the amount of, people in the house. Because, you can imagine, right? Like, so for a lot of folks who have autism, they're sensitive to the environment. And, so there's lights, there's cameras, there's a bunch of people, there's all kinds of stuff going on. That could be overwhelming very easily. So initially I was outside and I was watching all of this on a TV monitor. And yeah, I was like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'm sure I did like a quadruple take and was just like, what is going on? But what's funny is probably halfway through the day, you get so used to seeing it that it's kind of like, okay. Yeah, it's like, all right, we're doing it again.
I want to talk about that phenomena. I'm so glad you mentioned that. That makes me want to talk about that. We're going to take another short little break here. And we're going to talk more about the telepathy tapes, Dr. Tarrant's experience with it, being involved, and, psi phenomena and, psychokinesis, etc. More when we get back. Okay, we're back. And I want to talk about I don't know what the it's an integration of unbelievable results into a believable world potentially, and how quickly it happens when one is in the midst of experiencing something phenomenal, potentially even a spontaneous paranormal experience that could not even be sought after. Someone could just be going about their day or their night. Something miraculous is unfolding, and how quickly we can go from being shocked, fearful, etc., into acceptance and ho hum about it. It to me, it speaks to a larger issue, and or a larger theme here, and that is how quickly we as human creatures will adapt to our new reality. And you see it in movies all the time. People are freaking out because there's UFOs in the sky, or people can't be given this information, they won't be able to handle it. And then you look at the micro examples of such things as these unbelievable things that are happening because of the paradigm that is in place of materialism, meaning it's not possible, and how quickly, within not even a 24-hour period, it goes from quadruple takes, my jaw is dislodged from my body like a snake, to, okay, should we go get a burger or something? Like, you know what I mean? We're going about our day now. We've integrated this new information, this new reality that quickly. Is that something that is common, do you find, with people who are experiencing or encounter such things?
I'd say yes and no, right? I mean, I'd say yes in general, but the degree to that, I think, varies, right? Like, I feel like my shift to sort of, as you said, ho hum. I don't know if it'd be quite ho hum, but
well, yeah.
But yeah, it's like you don't feel like you have to watch every single trial anymore, right? It's kind of like, okay, like I've seen that. Like I know she's going to get them all right, so it's kind of like, okay, but. And I think that's the reason from the beginning that I didn't understand the magnitude, because the way Dr. Paul was talking about it was very ho hum. It was kind of like, oh, this is what we've got, and it's kind of like, oh, okay, all right. And then you see it, and it's like, whoa, okay, like how come you're not having a major reaction to this? And it's like, oh, you've been doing this for 10 years, okay, it's just sort of status quo. I think Kai, I don't want to speak for Kai, but my sense from her is that she would continue to get excited, like the next person, and see what they were able to do. And, she was really clever at coming up with unique tests and trying different things and being really creative with it and say, well, what if we try this? And then they would do that. Right. And so, kind of continuing that excitement and that just, place of awe. Some of the guys on the camera crew, I think it was kind of the same thing, right? Like they saw this all day long. And so I think it became a little bit more normal. But, at the end, they were still wanting to run their own tests, right? I talk about this example a lot with one of the people we were testing. His name's Houston, and just an amazing participant. I mean, he was so great. And 100% accurate, just knocking them out every time. And at the end of the day, one of the camera guys who'd been watching this all day, but his job is to film and stay out of the way. So, he was doing his job. At the end of the day, we're packing up everything and putting it all away. And he just decided to do his own little test and wrote a word on a piece of paper and held it to his chest and went up to Houston and just said, hey, do you know what word I've got written on this piece of paper? And, of course, Houston spelled it perfectly, friend, Friend. And it was like, which was cool because, he had his own personal experience with this, which was kind of cool. And it was clear that this wasn't his mom. This was just some random camera guy that Houston had no contact with all day long. And so again, like, some of these individuals, their abilities extend much further than, just with their mom. It seems like it's the strongest with their mothers, but then some of them can do it with virtually anybody.
Yeah. And it speaks to the paranormal is personal. And, the nature of, I think in a bigger level, on a bigger level, personal relationships are important. And maybe science can be too sterile when it removes all relationships from, and now it's I think, I'm not a scientist, but science is obsessed with the relationship between things, what causes cause and effect. But there's a different kind of relationship that exists between things and between creatures and animals. And there's emotion, there's memory, there's all kinds of stuff. And I think maybe science is flawed in that it has too narrow a definition of what a relationship is between things. And specifically with the non-speakers, I want to touch on this point too. And you've been around a few of them. They're people. And just because they can't speak doesn't mean they don't understand what you're saying and that they don't understand what's happening. One of the first images, and this is always kind of popped into my mind, and to me it's always been such a heartbreaking thing, was people with like advanced Parkinson's. I think of Muhammad Ali, and people see this guy who used to be a champion, used to be the peak of physical and wit, for days, so funny. And then towards the end, he's kind of, he needs help walking, or he's shaking because of the effects the disease has had on him. And people might think that he's like this quote unquote feeble guy who isn't intelligent or can't understand them anymore. But inside, he's still Muhammad Ali. He's still that guy who floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. He's still that guy who stood up and decided to take a stand and against the Vietnam War. He is still that mind inside. Yeah. And when you, to me, this is like the biggest gift of this podcast, is for the world to understand that the non-speakers have been unlocked from and set free from their prison of people thinking they weren't in there.
Yep. And actually, that's probably been the biggest impact on me is, I mean, it's a little embarrassing to talk about, right? But, my training as a psychologist, my understanding of autism and what that meant was actually really pathologizing. And it really was this kind of idea that it's like, yeah, there's nobody in there. They're not competent, and then so after meeting some of these individuals and seeing their wisdom and intelligence and humor and creativity, and it's like, wow, okay, like I totally missed, I was like, I feel really bad, like all these years that I've kind of had some sort of judgment or belief about these people. And it's really because it's exact. I mean, your comparison is actually, I think, important in certain ways, because people judge these non-speakers because of their inability to control their bodies, right? So they can't verbalize. They often don't have a lot of control over their fine and gross motor skills. And so from the outside, it looks like they're not competent. Because they may do things that look unusual, or, their behavior may look wild or something, but they're in there, and, genius level, many of them. I mean, like the amount of intelligence and wisdom is just crazy. And so for me, I think that's been the biggest lesson from all of this. I mean, yes, the telepathy is amazing, but really having a very different understanding. And not even with them, like it started to carry over in other parts of my life where I catch myself having a judgment about somebody based on how they look or what they're doing or what's happening. And I'm starting to catch myself now and go, hey, you don't know. You don't know what's going on inside. Just because what you see, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And so it's been actually really positive and growthful for me in that way. So I feel like they have a lot of lessons to teach all of us, because I'm going to assume I'm not the only one that does these things, right? That makes these judgments that aren't founded.
Yeah, and it's important to talk about that, because if we can't admit when we've done something it doesn't even have to be wrong. When we've gone about something in a way that wasn't beneficial to us or beneficial to the greater good, or, to everyone, I guess you could say, we did things the wrong way, or until we acknowledge that, we can't change and make a course correction. And that's not to say that we won't need to make another course correction somewhere down the road in the same area. But, if we truly do want to strive to get better, I mean, I've got more shortcomings than I care. My list of shortcomings is long. That sounds like something like Twain would say or something, right? I'm not calling myself Mark Twain right now, for the record, for people, but my list of shortcomings is quite long. Now, it is this thing where I never really would have thought about it, right? And not that I didn't care about these people, but I had experienced years ago, a woman I was dating, she worked at a group home, and some of them were some of the kids and the teenagers, young adults who live, or grown-ups who live there, had difficult speaking autism. And and one time there was a really sad situation that unfolded where a kid was constipated for like 2 weeks, right? Because just no control of the body. And then I went over, and like I had to go over because she called me and she's like, he finally released, and I can't handle this, right? So I went over there to help out, and you're just to be there. But there's somebody inside that guy, right? There's somebody inside that guy. He's not just some guy walking around who can't poop and just like with no thoughts. And I could only imagine the constipation one must feel in communication as well. And, the frustration that it would lead to. Yet these people don't become the most jaded assholes you've ever met in your life. They become these enlightened, or are these enlightened beings that you could just sit and be like, please tell me everything I must do with my life.
Yeah, you know what I mean. I've actually thought about that point that you're bringing up, which is, after you understand that, it's like, no, they know what's going on and they're aware of everything that's been happening, and it's like, oh my God, how could you go through all of that and not just be bitter and resentful and angry, and instead they're actually extremely loving, and seem, as best I can tell, extremely non-judgmental to everybody else, even though people are judging them. It's like they don't reciprocate that, and it's like, wow. So yeah, I mean, you might be right that, they're sort of enlightened beings, because it's like, I don't know, I couldn't do that. If I'd been treated that way, I mean, I can guarantee I would be resentful, pissed off, and generally unpleasant, to be around.
Right. It's like the origin story of every great villain in cinema or in books. Someone who's been wronged over and over again and becomes like the world's greatest villain because of it.
Right.
And yet they don't do that.
Right.
And they don't take that track. And, and considering, it's so remarkable to me. And it's awe-inspiring. It's emotional. And, I'm walking around the park listening to, I think it was episode 8. There's this really fascinating part of the series where, one of the non-speakers is traveling in the dream world to try to wake up their mother in the dream world. And I can't help but think about the same woman who worked with, I mean, the connection is no coincidence. The same woman who, she's a friend of mine. She's been on the show before. Her name's Erica. And she has these lucid dreams, right? And extremely vivid. And she had to take control because they were nightmares. And then she would go around, she would find people's dream selves, and she would be trying to wake them up. And so as soon as I'm hearing this in the telepathy, I'm like, oh my God, I heard about this like 8 years ago from someone I know. This is crazy. She's like, I got so close to being able to try to wake certain people up, but I was never able to get them. It's like I'd have these conversations and they'd be like, wait, so you mean I'm asleep right now? I'm like, yeah, just wake up so we can go fly through space and time. And it would never happen. But I'm wondering what, part of me, it starts to think like, okay, well, are the telepathy tapes too successful? Or is the government coming in to try to take these kids, these people and use them as tools and things like that, right? And I'm like, don't even let your brain go that way. I'm wondering, where do you think actually, we do have to take a little break here again.
Okay.
And we come back, let's talk about what we think the trajectory of maybe some of this research and where it potentially could be going in the future and the impacts of that. So we're going to be right back with Dr. Tarrant talking about more about the telepathy tapes, telepathy, psychokinetic abilities, and the like. Okay, we're back. And where do we think this is headed, this research and maybe this great awakening that's happening obviously there's a lot of people who already knew this was real.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, the teachers, the people who worked with the individuals who all possess. That's the fascinating thing, where they say all of us do this. All of us can do this. And to me, that's one of the there's so many mind-blowing things about it. But when they're just like, oh yeah, all of us can do this. What are the implications moving forward? And like, and by implications, I mean like great things that potentially could be happening.
Yeah. And, there's a few different ways to kind of, think about that question, right? Because certainly from a research perspective, I think this is going to spur a lot of research interest. And in fact, I'm working on another study to move this forward, right? To address some of the things that the critics bring up, to make sure we control for everything that we can possibly control, and just to get clean data, right? And again, it's not going to convince, if you've already made up your mind, no data that I collect is going to change your mind. I understand. But I think it's important to have something that's really solid, right? That is airtight. And so, there's going to be more of that research coming. And of course, partly what I'm doing too is looking at brainwave activity and what's going on in the brain when these non-speakers are engaging in telepathic abilities. And so, I think that's going to be interesting and useful as well, because, will it be possible to use that information to help the rest of us figure out, well, how do we shift ourselves into a space where maybe we can tap into a similar way of communicating? My sense is that probably, folks who are sort of neurotypical, if we want to use that term, and speak, I don't think we're ever going to get to the same place that the non-speakers are. They seem to be wired for this. However, I think we can develop these things, right? And in fact, the last an episode of the Telepathy Tapes, I forgot what Kai's calling it. It's kind of this supplemental,
like a bonus episode,
something like that. She's got a name for it, but now I can't remember it. Anyway, she just dropped the first one like a couple days ago, and it's actually talking about this guy named Dan, who, he's not autistic, he's verbal, and through a series of events, he kind of taught himself how to get to a space where he can, he's been able to 3 times, I think, go to the Hill, which is this place that the non-speakers talk about, where they all meet in kind of psychic space to hang out and talk with each other. And, he's been able to get there himself 3 different times and, interact with some of these non-speakers in this space. And then, kind of in normative waking consciousness, been able to confirm with them, that was actually real, that it wasn't just a made up hallucination or a dream or something else. And so, again, to me, it kind of points to the idea that, well, maybe we can all get there. in one way or another, or at least start to open up these capacities. And in fact, I forgot what episode it was, but one of the non-speakers talked about that this is our evolution, that this is where things are going. And I find that interesting because I know, some of the folks who are into UFOs and UAPs and aliens and that sort of thing. One of the common things that comes out is that aliens communicate telepathically. And some people hypothesize that they're our future selves, right? And so now who knows if any of that is true or what the deal is, but it's interesting that you've got these non-speakers basically saying like, this is the evolutionary trajectory of where we're going. And some other people have already speculated about that, right? That, in the future, we won't need to talk. It's a much more inefficient way to communicate. So I don't know where all of this is going. I mean, I hope where it's going is an awareness on a very short scale, small scale, an increased awareness that these things are real and that, these non-speakers have some amazing abilities so that they're more accepted and included into society in whatever way they want to be, right? That they're not sort of like othered and pushed out. And for me, and I think a lot of the people that have kind of really accepted what's happening in the telepathy tapes, it's opened their mind, right? That it's kind of like, oh, well, what does this mean? Because if this is happening, which again, I'm already convinced, but if this is happening, what does this mean? What does this mean about consciousness? It makes it really hard to be a rigid materialist, because all of a sudden you gotta go like, wait a minute. So where are my thoughts? Where do they live? Who am I? Do I have a soul? Does that move around? Can I, all of a sudden you have to entertain these ideas that maybe you wrote off and said, yeah, that's all mumbo jumbo, right? It's like, well, maybe it's not. Maybe there's more to this, and you have to consider that.
Well, yeah, 100%. And for me, materialism, in the way you're describing it, is like the rigid materialistic view is like, imagine materialism is the large, is the 100-foot stone wall protecting the castle. And, there's people out there like me trying to, shoot a flaming arrow at this wall, every once in a while, lit by the idea of idealism. But then you have like the telepathy tapes that come in and, at one point reached the #1 podcast in the world. And I feel like the telepathy tape is that, that 30-foot troll that they got that's carrying a big, a wall ram. And it actually starts shaking the entire wall of materialism. Like the big dog comes in to deliver, is it the fatal blow? We don't know. Probably not, because that wall is strong and thick, right? But guess what? We know that wall is not impenetrable anymore. It's starting to crack. And I love that. And I think collectively, the more people who charge against this wall, the more it cracks and the more it crumbles. But I was looking up the telepathy tapes while you're talking about that guy, Dan, who could go. And I think he was a helper. He's a helper at one of the schools, right? And so I don't see it on the Spotify feed, the bonus announcement. But it looks like there is an announcement about a documentary, season 2, and Non-Speaker University. But I haven't been able to find the bonus episode yet on the website. But the website is the telepathytapes.com, in case you're wondering. So, which, if you haven't seen it already or listened to it already, I highly recommend it. But I have skeptical friends who have actually listened or started to listen to this. And I want to get your perspective on this as we kind of put a bow on it.
Sure.
For me, I think it's very early on. Kai mentions, and then it turns out the dominating, paradigm or idea of our world is something called materialism. And for those of us, I guess, who have been, deep into the paranormal and psi research and all these things for years, it's something that we're pretty well aware of, and the restrictions that materialism provides, especially someone who does the work you do in the field you do. It's an overarching, like, it's almost like that awful teacher walking around the room looking over your shoulder to make sure you're not writing notes to someone, right? Like, it's like, no, we stick to the curriculum. Jeffrey, what are you doing? But when it comes to, I think, people who aren't into this stuff at all, I describe this podcast as a great way to, a great introduction to the world of the paranormal and psi research. Because I think one of the brilliant things that she does is she holds your hand and walks you through, especially if you're coming from deeply embedded in the materialistic world, which most people are. And she holds your hand and tries to help you, at least, if not walk out of the room of materialism, at least stand up from that beanbag chair you've been sitting in your whole life and stretch your legs a little bit, and maybe think that it's possible you might want to walk out the door and see what else is out there. Now, do you think that when it comes to, I don't know, maybe when you first started your career, do you see a drastic change in the willingness and the openness of researchers and the world in general to be acceptance of things other than the dominating materialistic worldview?
I mean, it's an interesting question. And, I don't know that I have the exact answer, but it does seem like, especially in the last few years, that there seems to be this subtle shift toward being more open to certain things. And I'll give a simple example. So last year, there was a research study that was published that was looking at psychokinesis. And, they set up a pretty elaborate research study to kind of zap the frontal lobes of research subjects, to inhibit their frontal lobe temporarily to see if that improved their psychokinesis abilities and things like this. And again, sounds a little far out, but this was published in a very well-respected journal called Cortex. And it was like, when I saw that, I mean, first I was super excited, but then I was also like, whoa, like, okay. Like, normally stuff like that would get published in journals like, something devoted to psychic research.
Like the ASPR journal or something, or
alternative and complementary, stuff, right? Like something that is already putting themselves out there is kind of being on the fringe a bit. And this is like, mainstream, the name of it's Cortex. It's about the brain, right? It's like, and it's like, wow, interesting. And, smaller scale, I did my own little small replication of that same research and presented it at the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research, which it's a much smaller scale, but I was shocked that they accepted it, right? Because it's like, I'm talking about stuff that's kind of out there, but they accepted it for a presentation at this conference. I was like, interesting. And actually, it was really well attended, the talk was. And so again, it makes me feel like people are being a little bit more open to some of this and willing to kind of step into that. Now, hopefully I'm not just biased from my own weird little worldview. Hopefully that this is true, what's happening, but it sure feels that way. Well, and again, even, circling back to the UAP stuff, right? Like the kind of attention that's starting to get, in, news media and whistleblowers coming out and folks that have worked with the government, right? It's starting to get this air of legitimacy that it hasn't had for a long time, right? And, we know that the government is studying these things. We've got these high-level people saying this is real, and so again, I feel like it's starting to shift some sort of idea that people have that's like, wait a minute, like we can't pretend like this isn't happening. Here it is. It's right in front of your face. They're giving it to you. So again, maybe the telepathy tapes is a part of that, right? Like you said, kind of like just chipping away. Oh, by the way, I wanted to go back to your metaphor of battering down. You've been watching too much Lord of the Rings, I think, but hammering at this wall of materialism. And what I think is really beautiful or ironic is that, the non-speakers who are the ones knocking this wall down are the most gentle, humble, spiritual people possible, right? So it's like, so somehow they're the ones who are getting the job done, right? It's like maybe a battering ram isn't the best way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's, hey, just, try to fully understand that the wall isn't there.
Right.
We put the wall up the whole time.
Yeah. There is no spoon.
Yeah. I mean, it is, it's beautiful and it's wonderful to think about, and it inspires hope. I hope it does for other people when they think about these things. And, I feel like we should give a shout out to all the non-speakers involved in telepathy. And, we can send them thoughts of love right now because we know they're hearing it. And we thank them for their participation, and God, I mean, just their grace under fire, a lifetime of fire. It's really, really confounding to someone who, might also be slightly bent towards, I told you so kind of behavior. Right. And, we got to melt that away. And I think they do such a great job of leading by example, leadership by example. And as opposed to just, standing on a soapbox with a megaphone telling us how to live our lives, they're just literally showing us how to.
Yeah.
And it's just so beautiful. And it's also a final note. I imagine this magical, the daily life of Dr. Jeff is just this. It's like I imagine like some laboratory where there's almost like, oh, I found an old brain and where I'm talking to it. It's in like a jar or something, like it's got wires hooked up to it. But it's like such a fascinating calling, and the experiments that you're undertaking and all the different projects you're involved with. I appreciate you making the time to chat as always.
Oh, I appreciate you having me on. I love talking about this stuff, and anytime you're desperate for a guest, just let me know. And
I'm gonna send you a phone it'll be like a purple phone, and every time that phone rings, it's me calling with the record button. And just as a reminder, people can go to psychicmindscience.com. You can find out everything about Dr. Tarrant there. There's 2 books. The book that really kicked off the interest, that you were talking about, was becoming psychic, I believe, right? That's the second book.
Yeah.
So I've got that book. You should check it out. There's things in there. It's an interactive book, so it's great. You can also go to Meditation Institute, find that on YouTube for weekly videos to help your meditation practice and tap into your powers. Anything else you want to leave the listeners with here today?
No, I think that's it. And I appreciate you, having me on and sharing this, and hopefully it'll initiate some more people kind of checking this out and opening their minds even more.
Yeah, 100%. And we are so excited about the future of the telepathy tapes, and your involvement with that. What a beautiful project. One of those things that's just like, oh, chef's kiss. This is wonderful that it's out in the world. And also other projects that you and I are involved in that I'll be excited to share with people once those materialize a little bit more. But there's some really fun stuff getting cooked up in the supernatural oven over here. So again, Dr. Tarrant, thank you for being here. And we look forward to the next chat, which will be sooner than you think, probably, after filling out that option.
All right. Awesome, man.